know what, I spent $30 watching this movie, I might as well try and get some of it back. So yesterday I watched the Demon Slayer Infinity Castle movie, and it was a movie. It was the best of the Demon Slayer movies, but I don't really think that's that high of a bar to breach. It's well animated, the fights were great, and obviously, you know, it did what Demon Slayer does best. It's up there with JJK and Solo Leveling for me as the big three of hype moments in aura anime, where the enjoyment comes less from the character writing and more from the, oh my god, look at the thingy, look at the, oh my god, this fight is so good, guy. And the unfortunate thing about Demon Slayer is that it really didn't have to be. As much as people hate the crybaby character archetype, you know, Tanjiro had potential as a character, he really did, but to fully flourish as a character, he just needed more time than Demon Slayer had, and unfortunately it just was never really going to work out with him at the end. Both in the movie and manga, Akaza's backstory is just carrying the writing of the entire series on its back. This is unironically the best part of the movie. Like, everybody who worked on this needs a fucking pat on the back, a beer, and some head under the table, because this is just sensational. The cinematography, the animation, the music, the sound design, the voice acting, it just, even in the dub, it all just fucking sold it so beautifully. It was better than any other adaptation I could have imagined for this. Like, it was... Damn. I'm being so dead ass when I say that it genuinely almost brought a tear to my eye. It was that good. But unfortunately, it just wasn't good enough to save the entire movie, you know, but I'm still genuinely going to say, if you want to give it a watch, that's going to be the peak of your experience. Actually, I'm just going to add there is also one other part that I enjoyed. Doma rage baiting Shinobu was just absolutely peak fiction. Doma is still my favorite Upper Moon demon just because of how much of an asshole he is. Unapologetically evil villains are some of my favorite kind, and Doma does it incredibly well. He's very fun to watch, and he has very little screen time in comparison to the others, so he never really got ruined by the writing issues that tend to occur when a character is left in a fight for a really long time, as shown with both Akaza and Kaigaku. You know, this movie covers 3 main fights that happened during the Infinity Castle arc. It's obviously not the entire thing, like, you're not gonna see a fucking Muzan Battle Royale final fight in this. It's only the first half, because to fit, like, however many chapters of an entire manga into one movie is going to be incredibly hard while keeping pacing and making the fights interesting. So this movie only really covers 3 fights, and that's Shinobu versus Doma, Zenitsu versus Kaigaku, and Akaza versus Tanjiro and Giyu. These last 2 fights are what I'm going to be mainly talking about today, because it just goes to show Demon Slayer's probably biggest writing flaw to me, and that being payoffs without setup. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, if you know what a setup and payoff is, it should be generally pretty easy to understand what I mean, but if you don't, I'll just give a little explanation. Why not? I need to pad this video. The best example of setup and payoff is, you know, Chekhov's gun. When you introduce a gun in Act 1, that's the setup. When you establish your character as a gun, you're going to expect that it's going to be used later on in the story at some point. You're putting it in the mind of the audience that this may become useful later, and even if they forget about it later on, when it comes into, you know, when it comes into relevance, they're going to remember, and they're going to, you know, it's going to bring a little callback to it, right? And then the payoff is when the gun actually gets used. Like, I don't know if this is a slasher flick, and in the last act, the wife is getting chased by whatever killer is, you know, killing or whatever, and she walks into the back room where she grabs the gun and she shoots the killer. Even if this doesn't put him down permanently, it's still something that was set up. We got the, you know, payoff for it, and the killer is downed even for a split second to let her escape. The gun was set up by the story, and we were given a payoff as a result. And while JJK only has the trigger of Chekhov's gun being a bunch of setups with no payoff, Demon Slayer has the barrel, which is just a bunch of payoffs with no setups. I'm going to explain the easier of the 2 first, being the Akaza versus Tanjiro fight, which mainly revolves around the introduction of the selfless state and how Tanjiro figures out how he's going to beat Akaza. So to understand Akaza's ability, basically he has like a little compass needle sort of thing that he can use where he can detect one's fighting spirit and like their murderous intent towards him, and this allows him to avoid attacks from his blind spots, which makes him basically impossible to defeat. And so while a now fully Slayer marked Giyu is in the middle of a fight with Akaza, Tanjiro is kind of wondering exactly how he's doing this bullshit, basically. How he's able to see shit behind him when, you know, he reasonably couldn't, and how he's detecting him. And they almost did this right, because Tanjiro goes back to the moment where Akaza was fighting Rengoku, something that we have seen before, where he understands fighting spirit, essentially. He heard Akaza talking about fighting spirit during that fight, and thus, the repeated mention of it now, we're getting it, we're understanding the setup. But then they pull some bullshit. In order to understand how it works, Tanjiro just fucking has a flashback to this conversation with Inosuke that we've literally never seen before. And the flashback itself isn't really the problem. The problem is the fact that this conversation in canon happened during a time where we reasonably should have saw it happen. This conversation apparently took place after the recovery period during the entertainment district, and this conversation was never seen, brought up, or even mentioned in little snippets I remember that conversation with Inosuke, before it becomes relevant. But if you only introduce something the moment it becomes relevant, it feels like an Asspull. Let's look at something relatively simple in early Bleach. Spirit ribbons are introduced during Uryu and Ichigo's first encounter. It's a simple sensing system that isn't really used that much throughout the story, but it does become relevant later on. It's established that Soul Reapers have red spirit ribbons while the others are white. It's a seemingly innocuous detail that's just mainly there to explain why Uryu is capable of understanding that Ichigo is a Soul Reaper without him being in his Soul Reaper form. However, later on in the story, when Ichigo is trying to unlock his Soul Reaper powers again, he uses this technique in the established color Soul Reaper spirit ribbons to find his Zanpakuto and the millions of boxes surrounding him. This is a simple setup and payoff, and while it's not anything crazy, you can see exactly how much worse this scene would have been if instead of seeing the conversation play out in real time and become relevant later, during this one moment, Ichigo just has a little flashback where he goes back and has a conversation with Uryu after their little hollow killing competition, and it's like, wow, Uryu, this was incredibly odd, but how did you know that I was a Soul Reaper before I even showed you? And then Uryu goes, oh, well, you see, it's a technique called spirit ribbons, it actually lets me see the spiritual pressures of people as ribbons, and Soul Reapers are red, and that was the first time that the entire thing was introduced at all. And it's the key factor for Ichigo gaining his Soul Reaper powers again and not being murdered as a hollow. Giving the setup and payoff in the same sentence only works at a comedy show. It doesn't work when writing a story. It's show don't tell. Instead of showing that this conversation happened, they told us the conversation happened, and then used the conversation that they told us about to basically be the key factor in defeating this motherfucker. Are we serious? Then we get to Zenitsu versus Kaigaku, and honestly, I don't have as much problem with Kaigaku himself. I think Kaigaku is actually a really great character in terms of setup, but Zenitsu... oh, Zenitsu. His development as a character was so fucking rushed. Oh my lord. No, the Hashira training arc is not an excuse. It can't explain the absolutely massive jump in skill that Zenitsu had to the point that we just dropped the sleep gimmick entirely. And him just kind of being locked in after Jikuro's death doesn't really explain the massive character shift he has in terms of demeanor and personality now. I mean, I get it, but it didn't feel earned. When it comes to the Flaming Thunder God, we don't even get any offhand mention that, Zenitsu was developing the technique at all. So just like everything else, it just feels like it came out of nowhere. The closest we see to Zenitsu having a personal development arc is just that one scene at the end of the Hashira training arc where Zenitsu just kind of looks a little locked in after seeing the message, and that's it. We go straight to Infinity Castle, and Kaigaku just got murdered, and Upper Rank 6 is defeated, and we win. The end. This would be such a hype moment in most other scenarios, but this just feels empty. And considering these are just such major parts of the movie, it brings the movie down a lot in general. It was about as good as a Demon Slayer movie can be, but, being a one-to-one adaptation of a relatively mediocre piece of media is still going to result in a mediocre movie. Could be a perfect one-to-one adaptation, but a perfect adaptation of mid is still mid. Either way, that's all I'm saying about the Demon Slayer movie. I'm going to bed now.